The Chief Minister acted swiftly after his appointment to create a new housing board to address the island's significant housing concerns. On tonight's agenda, we explore the housing crisis. Is it real or just perceived? And other than the announcement of the board, has anything actually happened? Tonight we have a robust exchange between retired political warrior Peter Karran and the Manx Professor of Detail and Complicated, Chris Thomas. More than just chestnuts roasting on tonight's show.
It's not about structure, it's not about governance, it's about actually addressing the real issues, and I do feel that we've made good progress, a group of us actually identifying what the real issues are and looking in the spring, perhaps even at the end of the winter, to make some real positive changes. So for instance, one of the issues that homeless people get stuck by is the fact that in 2014 we changed social security law whereby you can only have loans, emergency loans for things like deposits once in every couple of years, and I do hope now that Treasury is working on a programme to address that. In terms of another issue, which is vacant properties, under occupancy of some housing, over occupancy in others, I do think now we've got work in progress whereby in a realistic time frame, in a couple of years, we can actually begin to make progress to have real money available to help real people put empty properties back into use and to help people get on the housing ladder or move around into more pros.
This whole issue of vacant properties, I couldn't help but raise a wry smile there, because this was something I certainly remember discussing and campaigning for when I was first elected in 2003. Peter Karran, the issues there that Chris has just raised there, they'll be very familiar to you from your 30 years in Manx politics.
Well, it's typical blah, 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 isn't it? The situation is that what we've got to do is look more fundamentally. We've got to look at the issues such as how we address the housing crisis. For 30 years, we've talked about the issue of where certain houses have restrictions on its commercial use. So in planning at the moment, planning deals with design, size and location. Certain houses should have a situation where they're use and ownership. So them houses can only be bought under planning if they're an Isle of Man worker, you don't own a second residential property and you can't rent it out. And if I was in there now, I would be calling for 25% of all new housing to have that sort of restriction on. It's not revolutionary. It's actual common sense. It's a situation which is done throughout many jurisdictions throughout the world. Second level that we need to do, we've heard this about under-occupied houses. I hope this is not just another attack on council house tenants. I'm sick to death of them being blamed for the fact that government is in bed with the developers and the very people who want to manipulate the situation. And we hear the same rhetoric about freedom, the freedom to exploit. It's about making inclusion. And in my opinion, I'm very concerned about making sure there's a property owning democracy. There's many people of my age group, when the interest rates were at 15.5%, where I kept on at Dr. Moore month in, month out to keep the rates down. So I think it's important we start actually creating legislation and the environment for the freedom to flourish for all. And housing is not a luxury.
Chris, there's a whole barrow load of points there. How would you respond? Are you in bed with the developers?
Well, that's one thing I'll come to in a moment. But first of all, both of you went back into the past. So it's quite true there was an empty properties initiative previously, and there was an empty property initiatives committee. I've got those papers. They had conclusions. We need to retest those conclusions, and the way that they were proposing working, which didn't happen then, could happen now, and that's definitely on the table. Peter talked about the 25% affordable homes and putting a restriction on it. Under planning law, 25% of developments of more than 8 houses do have to be affordable, and we can change the definition of affordable. What's more, in places like Wales, they've actually got, for instance, they've broken down residential housing into owner-occupied residential housing and rented out housing, and we could do that, and that's something that's also under exploration. But In terms of being in bed with the developers, that's not how I've approached my job. I haven't actually met any developers in the 2 months that I've been in post. I have had lots of very important meetings, but they haven't been with developers. And in fact, and also to rise to the other challenge that Peter threw at me, which is that having a go at social housing tenants, I don't think so. In actual fact, I'm actually trying to redress the fact that for the last decade at least, housing policy has been more about social housing and local authority reform, and it hasn't been about the 37,000 houses or whatever it is that are not in the social housing sector. And I do want to think, for instance, about fulfilling the dream that was there at the beginning of Peter's career back in the 80s, 70s even, which is of a housing association. Wouldn't it be great in the Isle of Man if we could have a housing association that could create savings products for people to get on the housing ladder, to help key workers stay on the Isle of Man rather than having to go across to balance incomes with what's affordable in terms of living? And I want to focus on that area.
But isn't that in essence what the Isle of Man government's housing division is, a housing association?
And no, it's not. It's a government department. It's a division of a government department. There are good people in the housing division, but in the same way that I believe that health can benefit from a professionalisation of the planning, I do think that housing could benefit from having a housing association of reasonable size, filling gaps initially, and then perhaps working in partnership with some of the local authorities to do some of the stuff that goes on already in terms of social housing.
I'll bring Peter Karran in just a moment, but the talk was of a housing crisis. Has any work actually happened since the election to identify the scale of this?
So, for instance, we do have a real problem. We've got homeless people on the island. We've got 1,000 dwellings that are vacant despite the fact that we've got homeless people on the island. We've got a private sector condition survey that identifies that 4% of dwellings in the Isle of Man are unfit, needing on average 20,000 spending on them. And that means that some of them need a hell of a lot more than 20,000 spending on them. And in addition, we've got another further 12% that are in disrepair, needing 10,000 spent on them. So we need to find public resources to kickstart the private market to actually provide houses. Then we've got the unaffordability of houses. So many people want to purchase who can't purchase, want to rent a better place but can't afford to rent a better place, and so we've got to address market failures just in the way that Peter Karran suggests. One thing I would say though is I do think Peter needs to reflect on whether home ownership is the thing for younger people. It certainly was when I was being brought up, and it sounds like Peter always had that aspiration, but I think more and more younger people are telling me that they're not absolutely convinced that owning a home is the measure of success and lifestyle that they want for. They perhaps would be happier with good quality, affordable rented accommodation for certain periods of their lives, and perhaps that's something that we need to consider. I don't want to be biased towards a sort of Thatcherite dream. I would love to have called Peter a Thatcherite, but it sounds to me like Mrs. Thatcher when he was talking then.
So Peter, you've got it all wrong.
The usual rubbish that you have to put up with over 30 years. I'm not on about Chris Thomas being in bed with the developers. I'm on about government being in bed with the developers. They are making the agenda. They are legislators. They should be making the legislation so that we have a property owning democracy. Nothing to do with Mrs. Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher has the envious situation of bringing about the premature deaths of millions of people as a direct result of her policies. The situation is we're dumbing down expectations. Why shouldn't Manx people be able to own a piece of their land? We're going back to before the Land Reform Acts in the 1880s. And my suggestion is nothing to do with first-time buyers' houses. In planning permissions, a quarter of planning permissions in the future will have a restriction on as far as use and ownership. The second thing that we should be doing, instead of always attacking people for being rich in council houses, is the fact is that we should have a part equity mortgage scheme. I always use the example of my own parents in 1975 went to look at a house in Sunnybank Avenue. It'd gone up from 12,500 to 15,000. They could afford 12,000, but they couldn't afford the 15. Now, if they would have got the house under a part equity mortgage scheme, they would have released the house from 75 to 2018 for somebody who needed it in the council house. They'd have got 80,000 back in investment. What we're talking about is actually common sense. It's about fairness and the property market is being manipulated, and what will happen is there will be an absolute crash, and we'll end up with a situation where the rich will pick the pickings up for nothing, for sweeties. That's what we've got to avoid. Legislators are there to legislate, and the sooner they start legislating and start looking at some of the things that Mr. Thomas has looked at, because at the end of the day, Mr. Thomas has been left with a sprat, as I say. He will not be able to come up with this unless he can get sincere commitment and people out of bed with a vested interest that allows the situation at the present time. It is not about left or right, whether it's Mrs. Thatcher or whoever. It's about fair and just. Where's fair and just gone into politics?
And is it fair to say, Peter, that at no time has there been a housing minister who has had direct responsibility for dealing with the whole of the housing situation?
The situation's simple. They're all yam-yats. They're Tory to someone, Labour to someone, and the situation is that we need honest party politics than the one-party state by patronage. Now, admittedly, they have addressed some of the issues, like we've got rid of the sweeties for department membership.
You're listening to Chair of the Housing Board, Chris Thomas MHK, and former MHK Peter Karran. Isle of Man government, the new government, has recognised that this is a crisis, this is a major issue. They've appointed Chris. To a certain extent, though, Chris has been given a fairly a dud hand, because he's not a minister and he doesn't actually have any power or control as yet.
But the problem is the only situation is when I first was elected, we had a housing crisis. A housing crisis where we ended up with a situation where we had members talking about, oh, well, your parents should be able to afford to buy your house. My mother's pride and joy was her Woolies pearls. There's no way that my parents could afford to buy a house. And they are equally out of touch with reality as a situation. They are legislators. Chris has mentioned that in Wales, we've now put restrictions on certain houses' use and ownership. That has got to come in. It's not communism. It's not capitalism. It's about fair and just to our young people, which if we don't address, we will destroy the whole economic base because we won't have young people living in the island.
It is not unreasonable to say that very little really happened in the last 5 years in relation to housing. There's lots of talk, but there wasn't an awful lot of actual sort of tangible results from 5 years of the previous government. Are we going to hear lots of talk and very little by way of action this time round, or can you put your hand on your heart and say there's going to be some real progress now?
I hope there will be real progress, and I think you're right. I think the last 5 years are about taking forward some of the stuff that you and I started when you were Minister for Infrastructure and I was responsible for housing. And the reason I wanted to rise to this challenge was because I do feel I've developed the relationships and the knowledge and the experience 2014 to 2016 working with UFIL, responsible for housing, local authorities, but also having that responsibility in DEFRA for environmental health and in home affairs for things like fire regulations and so on. So to go back to answer one question that you made and then to compliment Peter, but the point that you made is I do think there was a golden age in terms of governance, because I think Dalgey actually had more of the housing functions together than we've currently got. I think it was a retrograde step to break up Dalgey. So the officer team that I have met with and am working with and have put together a work stream in association with to a significant extent is basically in part recreating Dalgey and adding other bits back into it. So that's where I'm coming from. That's the Department of Local Government and the Environment, which had environmental standards for housing, but also planning, but also the housing function all together. Now to come to the compliment to Peter, he's exactly right. We need to revisit the shared equity scheme, because that was launched again under us. I took it through on your behalf in 2014. But now the eligibility thresholds, the payment terms, the flexibility in paying off loans, they're all out of date and they need to be revisited. But beyond shared equity, we've got to go into rent to buy schemes, and that's where a housing association comes in, because a housing association can actually borrow money probably more efficiently than the any individual local authority, and it can probably use it more efficiently to help people, whether they've got the aspiration for home ownership or whether we want to create good quality rented accommodation that's affordable to people who are only going to be on the island for 3 or 4 years. And then finally, we haven't only got the shared equity type approach, we've also got other parts of planning. Peter's pointed to the 25%, that's a good suggestion. He's also pointed of constraining use, but we've also got the possibility to go back to the period in the 50s or so when we can have comprehensive treatment for areas. Under the new area plan for the East, for instance, parts of Douglas, we could treat them comprehensively in terms of coming up with financial packages, and that's what the Empty Properties Initiative was about in part, and I'd like to follow that up and do something about that in the last 5 years. It might well be that I've been set up to fail, but I hope not. I hope that the Chief Minister recognises there's a housing crisis. He put a good person onto it, and I hope to be that person to work with colleagues. But I'm not going to do that if I'm going to have to go and if I'm going to have to do it in the wrong way. So I do hope that the terms of reference can be agreed in the next few days, and then we can get budgets and I can have staff, and it won't all have to be me doing it in this basis.
If this is a crisis, you still haven't actually got any of the machinery of power that you need to do this.
But again, I disagree. Structure's not the most important thing. The most important thing is setting off in the right direction. And I want to compliment the officers that I've worked with and the politicians that I've worked with. And in fact, the Chief Minister's acknowledged this to me already. We do have the right 7 work streams that we need to take forward for the 5 years, and there's acceptance on those. It's just, Chris Thomas has got a history of being a little bit troublesome and a little bit difficult.
No, surely not.
And I think there are some people who want to make sure that I'm controlled. But to me, you've got to understand how people operate, and in a crisis you've got to respond in a crisis way.
So Peter, you thought you were bad, but apparently Mr. Thomas is the new troublesome member of the Keys.
I was never a troublesome member. All I was trying to get accountability, and he's right. It's not about the issue about structure. That's the situation that they hide behind. The real issue is accountability, not just in housing but other things. Part equity mortgage scheme has to have the liability of having restricted whole planning like the Liberal Party brought out 10 years ago. The issue has got to be is we've got to try and create a fair market for people. This hedge fund investment programme, these other people buying multi-numbers of houses, on freehold houses, they're free to do it. But what we've got to do is bring about the legislative package so that we actually put a fair playing field. Housing associations are a disaster in the UK. You've got to stay on benefit if you're in a housing association house in London because you can't afford the commercial rent. We've heard what Chris has said about Wales. The Lake District's now doing it. We raised it before the Lake District ever did it. What we've got to do is we've got to actually start looking at how we put them runs on the ladder for a property owning democracy. That's not right wing. That's about fairness.
Is that not something that should be being looked into? Because certainly that seemed to be a very strong theme during the run-up to the election that people were most concerned about.
Of course, the problem is who lobbies these people? Who wines and dines the civil service? Who looks after these people? And the fact of the matter is, what I'm proposing, bringing in planning that certain houses have restriction on the use and ownership, they can't buy them. Full stop. And if you buy that house, you can't then go and buy a house in the buy-to-let market. And that legislative package can be there, would be there if there was a political will. There is a finite amount of land for housing, and what we've got to make sure that people who need them for homes and not for investment portfolios gets priority. And it's up to us to make that environmental freedom to flourish for all. These young people are being denied that opportunity, and what will happen if we're not careful is we'll end up destroying the whole economic base of this island. We're already got to start looking for new engines because the dodge, diddle and fiddle economy is over. This will hasten the demise of the economy if we don't address affordable housing for people.
So Chris Thomas, then, if I was wanting to buy a house, and I've had a listen to this debate so far, I'm probably thinking, well, this all sounds well and good, but how does this actually affect me? Am I actually, in the next year or two, going to see any significant change? What would you say to said listener?
Well, there are all different types of people, but if that person is okay to be thinking about buying a house, I hope that we can improve the way that the housing market operates. And Peter's outlined some suggestions. The whole idea of dealing with gazumping is another issue that's been petitioned about recently, and I'm trying to take that forward in this work stream. But we've also got people in the Isle of Man who are really poor, and some of the early wins for us will be completing the work that was started on defining homelessness in law and actually having an emergency housing facility provided under law, which is something that both of you have tried for decades. And I hope that we can actually realise that, and beyond that, actually have supported living environments so that people have houses first from which they can build good lives, good incomes and good personal relationships. And then thirdly, for those who are not as yet able to afford that aspiration to have a house, we need to make the rented market work better in the Isle of Man. And that's about finding some way, and we're going to have to work with banks, and I've been talking with banks, I haven't been talking with developers, we're going to have to work with institutional investors to actually improve the standard of housing and also to address some failures in the market. One of those is to do with deposits and who has the deposits and who decides when you get the deposit back and how you get the deposit back, and then also to arbitrate disputes, and that's something that I hope to make quick progress on as well. So in summary, there's some of the people who I hope can get some solace from how their lives will improve after this work. It might be just helpful to conclude from my point of view by just bringing in a couple of other issues that we haven't really talked about as yet. One of which is that I think Peter is happier with greenfield development than perhaps I am and perhaps many other people in the island are, because in the election I think Peter was quite keen on making sure that we had houses wherever they are. But I think the emphasis in the current House of Keys is very much on filling up brownfield sites and getting rid of those empty and under-occupied properties. Perhaps I'm wrong, but that's a feeling that I think I've got to manage. And the second point that hasn't really come up as yet is the whole business about housing association. Peter suggested they were always to do with high rents. I don't think so. There's always a Manx way, which can be different from the British way, and I'm talking about a housing association in terms of structuring the approach. I'm not talking about letting the private sector run rampant with people's lives. That's definitely not what I'm talking about.
So unusually, Peter, you get the final word on this.
Well, I have to say, as far as Chris is concerned, he said nothing new. As far as this crisis is concerned, the fundamental principle has to be about a level playing field. The fundamental principle that lots of other jurisdictions have done what I've requested for the last 25, 30 years in this island in order to make fairness. Property owning democracy is not to do with being right wing or left wing. I don't need any lectures about the poor. I was the one that fought for the poor more than anybody when I was in there. And we brought about major significant changes. But at the end of the day, what we've got to do is we've got to bring into planning restrictions on the commercial ability. It's an absurdity that people can buy up 10, 20 houses. We've seen it in the past where we had one development where 10% of the development of 800 houses was owned by two people. Why aren't we learning the lessons of that? Let's stop having them have the ear of government, and let's start creating the legislative facilities that can be there to put that fairness back into society.
So Peter, do you mean actually bring in the Residency Act that's been on the statute book? Do you mean?
No, you know what I mean, Chris. The situation is the fact that these houses would not affect anybody as far as new residents are concerned, because they wouldn't be allowed to buy them in the first place. So that would be another reason, another thing that would be done supernumerary to Residency Act. You know how I feel about residency as far as that's concerned. Let's keep to the point. The point is, it's been a disaster for years. We managed to put wages from 45% of the Brits 30 odd years ago when I first was elected. We've now got wages above the UK, but the fact is it's eaten up by this cartel, abusive monopoly on a cornerstone of our democracy, where affordable housing should be there.
I'm Phil Gawne. Guramayu. Thanks for listening.